All right. I believe that we are live, everybody. Great to be here today with my brother, James, who is one of the premier scholars and gentlemen, definitely one of the best people to talk to on this incredible topic. We're going to be talking about the woman caught in adultery. Is there any basis to say that this does belong in the Bible, or do we have to follow along with what modern day scholars say that, hey, that isn't in any of the oldest texts. Hey, that is not that doesn't belong in the Bible. We need to remove it. Better critical editions would lack it. Where do we fall on that today? We are with an incredible guest, my dear friend and brother, James SNAPP. But before we even begin talking, I do want to begin with a Trinitarian prayer in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, please guide us to all truth in your word, the truth that can only be found in your inerrant word, your word that we truly believe has been preserved. Please guide us to all truth. Let all glory and honor go to you, our triune God. Please illuminate, enlighten the dear brother James, and please guide me to be able to be suitable, a good host for the brother, and let everybody watching and everybody tuning in, please let them be edified by the session we have today. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Brother, what a joy it is to be able to be with you. And indeed, we're talking about a very important topic today, because as you know very well, what do we hear scholars, a number of modern day scholars saying that, this doesn't belong in the Bible. What are your thoughts on that? And what do we mean by the story of the woman taken in adultery?
The story of the woman taken in adultery is generally just another way to refer to John chapter 7, verse 53 through John 8:11. Those 12 verses in John are referred to as the story of the woman caught in adultery, just by the title, The Adulteress. It's also common among textual critics to call it the pericope de adultera. Sometimes the ending varies a little bit depending on what phrase you use, but if not that phrase, then a phrase very much like that.
Great point there, brother. And we how about we hop on over to it? So, do we find what Bible edition should I open to be able to see that text? What would you recommend we look at? Which one?
Well, practically any Bible will have the text. Oftentimes it will be, for instance, in the Christian Standard Bible, it will have a. I'll pick that up here. It will have, after verse 52, there'll be a vertical line across the page, and then an announcement, a heading note that says the earliest manuscripts do not include 753 through 811. And then there'll be a footnote which gives a few more details, or which attempts to give more details about the state of the evidence. Now, what you'll usually not see in the footnotes is an announcement or a statement of how many manuscripts have and don't have the text of the story of the woman caught in adultery. Right now, there are about 270 manuscripts that don't have it, copies of John that don't have it, and about 1,500 that do have it. So numerically, the ones that do have it greatly outnumber the ones that don't. But the ones that don't include a core group of manuscripts that represent the Alexandrian text, the form of text that most modern translations are based upon. For instance, the Papyrus 66, Papyrus 75, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, none of those have this passage. Codex N doesn't have the passage. And to get a more extensive list, you maybe go back to the conversation we had before, where I got into that in a little bit more detail. But because that group doesn't have it, it's not just the number, but it's that particular group of particularly cherished or weighted manuscripts. Those are the ones that they depend on the most for the basis of the text they're presenting. Because it's not in those particular manuscripts, they consider those manuscripts very valuable. When they don't see it in those manuscripts, they want to make a point to say, hey, it's not in, no, they don't say our favorite manuscripts, but instead they will say the earliest manuscripts, or the earliest, most reliable manuscripts, something to that effect.
Great point there. Let me go ahead and briefly read so the audience to get an idea of where we're coming from and they can realize what we're talking about. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now, early in the morning, he came again into the temple, And all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery, in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who was without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last, and Jesus was left alone with her, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Is that an accurate rendering of the account of the woman caught in adultery?
Yes.
Okay. So then that would bring me, I guess, what a fascinating discussion, brother. We hear, well, let me ask you right away first, and I kind of know your answer, but either way, for the audience to know where we're coming from, do you agree that this account of the woman caught in adultery does belong in the Bible from the evidence that you've looked at the most ancient manuscripts, at the earliest church father testimony? What are your thoughts on that?
The evidence certainly does not all point in one direction only, but on balance, I would say that there is evidence to lead to the conclusion that it belongs in the Bible.
And that I will have to admit, brother, is a very balanced kind of answer, a very, very good one. Is there anywhere in particular that you would like for the audience to be aware of? This is going to be incredible. We have some, indeed, some incredible witnesses, and we know that there are some scholars that have made some quite audacious, quite shocking claims. Is there any particular slide that you would like to look at first, brother?
Perhaps we could begin with the slide of the Old Latin Capitula, or one of the Old Latin Capitula. Yes, that. Just that first one there. What you're looking at here is not a particularly ancient manuscript, but this comes from the Latin tradition. In the early days of the Latin Bible, before the Vulgate was introduced by Jerome, and the text was initially, attempts were made to standardize it, and that was redone a little bit each time, because old readings from the Old Latin kept slipping into the Vulgate text after Jerome, under Pope Damasus in the late 300s, had made an attempt to standardize it as what we know as the Vulgate translation. But there are also other Latin translations, or probably going back to one, but they got very diverse very, very fast, because in the Old Latin tradition, part of the purpose was not just to preserve the form of the text, because once you've left the Greek, you're no longer concerned about the exact form, but to convey the meaning of the text. And so they would tend to excuse me, I've got a call coming in.
No problem, brother. Not a problem at all. In fact, if you have to take that, you can go ahead and take it right away, and I can talk for a little bit if you want to take that.
Okay, let me come back to you in just a minute.
No problem at all. I'll talk in the meantime while the brother James has to step away a little bit. The kind of material that we're looking at today is very edifying material, because we're going to look in a little bit and we're going to recognize that a number of very popular scholars, indeed, we're going to look at a scholar that is a friend of mine, that at the end of the day, I may have to disagree with them. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing with people if you do it in a charitable and an intellectual fashion. At the end of the day, what is the kind of conclusion we have to come to? We have to examine what do the majority of trustworthy manuscripts say, and then what is the tradition of the early church fathers? Do the early church fathers show any kind of tradition in any particular way? By the way, as you all can see, I am looking at the chat as well in YouTube. So hold off for the moment for questions you might have on your mind. We will get to them shortly. Do not worry. We're going to go probably for maybe about an hour or close to an hour, and then we're opening up Q&A. Anything you may have in your mind in terms of the topic at hand, or really in terms of textual criticism, the manuscripts, anything along those lines, feel free to ask the brother whatever you think is on his mind. By the way, when you look at the tradition of this text, it's a very important one in pointing to the deity of Christ. When we see, and I wonder what that says. Okay, when we see that he stooped down and he wrote on the ground with his finger from, and I don't know them all off the top of my head, but from early church fathers that have provided commentary in this verse, they note the very clear and the incredible reference to his finger, the fact that God, what did God use? He used his finger to write the very commandments. And I see the brother James is back. Brother, welcome back.
Thank you. So about the delay.
Not a problem at all, brother. So we were looking at this right here when you were speaking about Jerome during the time of Pope Damasus. So this is quite a significant fragment here.
Well, this is just a detail. There's more to the manuscript than just this part.
Yes.
But to explain what I mean by the Old Latin versus the Vulgate, in the Old Latin text was sometimes, when you had an Old Latin manuscript, you would get more than just the text of the gospel that the manuscript was about. If you had a copy of the four gospels, you would also get various supplements. It was kind of like when today people will go to the store and say, I want a Bible for studying. I want a Bible to really for analyzing the text. And I might give you a Bible that's half Bible and half commentary. But when you know that's what you're getting, that's what you ask for. That's fine. But in the Old Latin, sometimes they would preface each gospel with a list of chapters. Now, there was nothing inspired about how they divided up the text, but they would end up with a list of chapters, and along with a list of just the simple numbers, like you find in any Bible when you have a table of contents. You would also have a brief description of, in this chapter, you have a synopsis of what you would find in that chapter. And so when you look at the chapter list, or what's called the capitula, in those summaries of the chapters, you won't be able to make exact quotations of any length because it's meant to be a summary. It's meant by nature. That's just the nature of what we're looking at. But in those descriptions, you have, although you don't have long quotations, you do have references to the events in that chapter. Now, these are not like the same chapter divisions we have today, where you have a 21 chapter Gospel of John. You might have much different divisions, but here you see the number 30, and off to the right is the description of what's in that chapter, and you can see the XXX for 30, and then at the very beginning, here is where Jesus dismissed an adulteress and stated that he was the light of the world, and it goes on from there. So this is an Old Latin form called the CY form, and the reason why it's called the CY form is because it's been dated by various researchers in it, especially De Bruin, and this was some time ago, back in like 1912 or so. When he analyzed it, he said this is from the time of Cyprian, or he thought maybe just a little bit after Cyprian, because it mentions the story of the woman caught in adultery. So the time of Cyprian would put this chapter summary in the mid 200s, or just shortly after the time of Cyprian. Cyprian, being bishop at that time, the early 200s to the mid 200s. So although we don't have the text of John from that time, we do have this echo of an Old Latin chapter summary from before the time of Jerome, and this particular chapter summary, this particular form of it, is assigned to either the time of Cyprian or a little bit afterwards, which would put it, basically contemporary with some of the early papyri. This form of the Old Latin chapter summaries in Latin, if it comes from just shortly after the time of Cyprian, well, that's before the making of Codex Vaticanus. That's before the production of Codex Sinaiticus, which is extremely significant. This would be one of the oldest, even though it's an echo of that witness, that still means the witness is there. So it's almost like having a patristic reference from that time to the Old Latin chapters and what was in the Old Latin text that accompanied this Old Latin list of chapter summaries. And there are several other old forms of the chapter summaries. You could look in I think the Bruin's chapter summaries. He lists multiple forms of this collection of chapter summaries. They all have there's one that doesn't just because it's very, very, very concise. But you can look in the Old Latin chapter summaries and you can see by far the majority have either what you see here, a reference to the adulteress in one form or another, not necessarily this exact form, or a reference to Jesus, going to the Mount of Olives, which would be a reference to chapter 8, verse 1. So the Old Latin chapter summaries, whenever we look at them and see what do they have in their text, well, in the Old Latin chapter summaries, they have the woman caught in adultery. And they have it just, it's not, we don't see the whole chapter in the chapter summaries because they're summaries, but we do see a reference to the adulteress, and it's never, is it here, is it there, is it way back there? No, it's right here where we would expect it to be in chapter 8 before Jesus says he's the light of the world. So that's a very significant reference. And again, there's not just one, there's several of that in the Old Latin chapter summaries. And that doesn't mean that they all go back this old to the time of Cyprian, but they are very uniform as far as where do they assign the passage to be. What is it? Where does it show up? Do we have any references in Matthew or Mark, any in Luke in the chapter summaries? We see it right here in John in chapter 8. Now there's also I don't think we covered it, but don't forget that first sentence of chapter 753. I think Morris Robinson has often pointed out, when people say that this was just a story that was floating around, which I think you'll find is a almost dominant view in some circles, Morris Robinson has a very effective answer to that. What kind of story floats around but begins with the words, "And everybody went home"?
Yep.
Just let that sit there for a while and think, how likely is that this was floating around and it begins, "and everybody went home"? Who starts a story like that if it's just going to be self-standing?
It's a really, really good point you bring up, brother. And I wonder to kind of maybe pick your brain a little bit. Do you know if Augustine utilized this particular text?
Yes, not only did Augustine utilize it, but so did the people around him. He mentions their references to how they approached it. And for instance, Faustus, one of his a contemporary of Augustine that was I think a Manichaean, but a heretic of some sort. Faustus commented on it. Erasmus, excuse me, let me back up. I'm already thinking of Erasmus. But no, hundreds of years before Erasmus. In Augustine's writings, he refers to a comment so it's like Faustus according to Augustine. But Faustus used it, and Augustine also refers to a group of unnamed pagans. He doesn't get very specific about who's doing this, but he says there were some unbelievers out there who were criticizing Jesus for writing in the ground. They thought that was that seems so undignified to do that. So not only does Augustine reference it, but so does his contemporary Faustus, and so does another group contemporary to Augustine. So Augustine is really not just one witness, but in his own writings he refers to two other groups that possessed this text.
Now, it would bring me to my logical conclusion. I remember I've talked to you about this before, and I think the audience would be very edified in hearing. If we hear that about St. Augustine clearly utilizing it and believing it to be a part of the actual text, biblical text, how likely would it be, because in my opinion, it would definitely be likely, that at those incredible great councils, which we know that he was instrumental in putting together, the councils of Hippo and Carthage, where the biblical canons were spoken of there, and you've got the list of the Old and the New Testament. How likely is it then that this text was included there if Augustine was so instrumental in those councils?
I'd say in the Latin text that Augustine was using, I don't think there's any doubt that it was in that particular Latin text. Now, that doesn't necessarily carry a lot of weight with the folks that are producing, major Bible translations these days.
Mhm.
But to look into Augustine's view of the story of the woman caught in adultery, he clearly believed that it was part of the Gospel of John. In fact, he even had a theory. He said in some copies that he had, I'm not going to quote this exactly, but you can go to the writings of Augustine and clearly find them. I mentioned this in my book and also at my blog, that Augustine proposed that in the copies in which it was not found, it wasn't there because some of the good guys, no, they're not heretics. They're Christians. He said some Christians, but Christians of weak faith, people that don't think that everything is going to solve itself in the providence of God. Augustine says that there are some Christians who, out of fear that their wives would use this passage to excuse themselves, because of this reason, some Christians removed it from their copies. In other words, Augustine's thinking somewhere out there's going to be some Christian's wife who might be just new to the faith or might not even belong to the faith, but she's going to go out there and commit adultery. Well, when her husband finds out and he says, this woman has committed adultery, the woman will then say, but Jesus forgave adultery, so why don't you? Isn't this a free check for me to go ahead and commit adultery? And out of concern that situation might arise, they removed the passage from the text. That was Augustine's theory. Now, I think Augustine is just guessing. I think the passage was removed for an entirely different reason, significantly earlier than Augustine. But Augustine, working with the materials that he had, which weren't in Egypt, but they were farther west, in Hippo, around the area of Carthage. But that's a theory that Augustine put out there. But he clearly himself believed that it was authentic. He didn't think that was a valid reason, obviously, for dismissing the text.
Now, do we have? Well, I guess it would be important to go to a particular slide if I want to ask you a particular question. So, how true is that statement there from Dr. Dan Wallace, where he says you don't see it in any of the fathers of the first millennium? Now, we already know that there are some fathers that definitely do quote it, but to what extent do we actually have? Do we have a good amount of evidence from fathers other than Cyprian, other than Augustine? What kind of evidence, what kind of patristic evidence do we have?
Well, I think that what happened here is that Dr. Wallace, when making this statement in one of his courses on textual criticism, I think he was using as one of his sources Bruce Metzger's textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. Metzger very, very heavily favors the Alexandrian text, the text of Egypt. And there's some reasons for that are good, some reasons are very questionable. But I think what happened is that perhaps Dr. Wallace might have simply forgotten to mention Greek, because Metzger in his textual commentary, if I could take time to turn there, but says that we don't have the story of the adulteress mentioned by any Greek fathers for 1,000 years. Now, there's two ways that's wrong. First, we do have the church history of Pseudo-Zacharias Rhetor, and it would take a long time to dive into the weeds on this one, but the short end of the story is that there's an account in a Syriac text that's based on a Greek text that mentions a copy of the Gospel of John used in the 500s that clearly had a story, not necessarily the story, but clearly had a story of the woman caught in adultery. So that statement that was made by Metzger is not entirely true, because the church history of Pseudo-Zacharias Rhetor. Also, when Metzger wrote that, he didn't start writing this textual commentary and then finished it the same day. Probably by the time that he wrote that statement and the time he finished the book, some of the writings of Didymus were discovered in Tura, Egypt. Old copies of some of the writings of Didymus, Didymus the Blind, from the writer from the 300s. He and Jerome knew each other. And
I hate to interrupt you, brother, but just to clarify, for the audience to know, Didymus the Blind is quite an important figure to bring forth, isn't he? Correct me if I'm wrong, but was he not either one of the leaders or somebody in high rank at the Catechetical School of Alexandria. He was a pretty focal figure, wasn't
He was important. He didn't really, not in degrees of rank of as far as hierarchy,
he?
but
Okay.
in terms of status, as everybody knows that this guy knows a lot. He did have
Yeah.
considerable clout. You can look in Lives of Famous Men, and
Yeah.
Jerome gives him quite an admirable description. So in Didymus's uh, writings that were discovered at Tours, so fairly recently discovered, relatively, Didymus mentions that now remember, this is a blind person writing, but he says we found in a copy of the Gospels, and again Didymus gives kind of like Mara did in Pseudo Zacharias Rhetor, a story of an adulteress. Now, again, it varies quite a bit from what we see in most of our English copies of John, but it's clearly a story of an adulteress. And so there's much more than nothing in the Greek fathers of the first millennium. We have the Pseudo Zacharias Rhetor, and we also have Didymus the Blind. Now, when Metzger made that claim, now we don't really know exactly what time chronologically Metzger wrote his textual commentary. I like to kind of be optimistic and say, well, when Metzger wrote that, he just wasn't aware of what Didymus wrote, and at the time, also the church history of Pseudo Zacharias was also somewhat obscured. It'd be an easy reference to forget. But here we are, 40 years later. Why are we still saying what Metzger said when we all know it's false? Maybe it's because we have tenure and just don't go back and double check what we've said to 100 classes before this. Maybe we're just being careless, but also it's wrong not only because there are Greek fathers from the first millennium that talk about the story of the woman caught in adultery. In Mara's copy that's mentioned by Pseudo Zacharias Rhetor, it's mentioned there, and also in Didymus's copy, it's mentioned there. Now, there is a little bit of wiggle room here because Didymus doesn't say exactly which gospel he's looking at, but where else would it be? And if it's going to be some obscure gospel of Joe Schmo out there, wouldn't you make the step to clarify exactly which gospel it is if you're not going to take for granted that your readers will take for granted that it's the gospels that you already know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's somewhere in there. So I don't think that's really a weighty problem. But a weightier problem is when it's said that you don't see it in any fathers of the first millennium. Now that is a very bad mistake, omitting the word Greek. I mean, it's a bad mistake to say there's not any Greek fathers of the first millennium. That's bad too. But to say that you don't see in any fathers, Greek or Latin, that's just ridiculous. Because let me just read you some. Pacian of Barcelona, Apostolic Constitutions, Ambrose of Milan, Ambrosiaster, Jerome, Rufinus, Augustine, Faustus, Sedelius, and so forth. Peter Chrysologus, Leo the Great, the source document of Codex Fuldensis, Prosper of Aquitaine, Quo Valdeus of Carthage, Galatius, Apologia David, which is probably a writing that Ambrose wrote, but we're not completely sure. But that's probably That's probably Ambrose again. Gregory the Great and Cassiodorus. How many did I just name? There 12.
You named a lot of figures that I would call patristic pillars there, brother. There's a lot of really solid, meaty evidence there.
Yeah, and the people that pay for the Credo course or that have partaken in the Credo course, they're fed a statement and they absorb this statement. No fathers in Latin or Greek, no any fathers in any language from the first millennium. That's the first 1,000 years we're talking about. Well, nobody uses it for 1,000 years after the Gospel of John is written. Excuse me? That's just ridiculous. And yet this
Patently
is being
absurd.
taken seriously by scholars at Dallas Theological Seminary and by all the people that have watched Daniel Wallace's work on this passage.
So really what we've got here for the audience that are tuning in and wondering, we've got a statement from a figure, as we know, Dr. Dan Wallace, who is, by the way, I know Dan Wallace personally, but whenever there are problems, statements that are made that are problematic. As people that love the truth, that love the gospel, that love the inerrant word of God, we've got to, in a charitable fashion, call them out. That is what we're doing today. We're having an incredible conversation with the incredible James SNAPP. We're talking about whether or not the story from the Bible, the Gospel of John, the woman caught in adultery, modern day scholars, plenty of them tell us, hey guys, that doesn't belong in the Bible. In fact, you hear it kind of like a brick hit over your head. If you're ever talking with somebody and somebody says, hey, don't judge me, remember that story. And then nowadays, because of people, unfortunately, in the scholarly realm, one interlocutor will reply to the other and then we'll say, well, that doesn't even belong in the Bible. But as we're looking at today, the brother James is showing us, it definitely, the evidence does lean more towards one of the direction, as we can clearly see that. Isn't that correct, brother?
Well, but before we leave Dr. Wallace entirely, I think I have a couple of other statements that he made.
Sure.
Can we see another one?
Definitely.
Just go ahead and scroll down there. I think I put them together.
You want that one or that one first?
Either one will do.
We'll go with that one first.
Let's take both of them in order.
There
First is a statement. We have 3 magistrate manuscripts out of the 322 that we have that actually have this passage. That's it. Most people that encounter this statement conclude this is the takeaway is, oh, we have 322 copies of the Gospel of John and only 3 of them have it. Well, what a lopsided, I mean, what kind of person could imagine that it belongs there when we only have 3 manuscripts out of 322 uncials that we have that actually have this passage? I think that's the takeaway that a lot of people take away. I think Stephen Boyce perhaps prepped a little bit by this kind of statement, made the same mistake in one of his recent online statements. But in the real world, it's not like that. Dr. Wallace's statement here is simply wrong, and this statement should be withdrawn. It should be withdrawn from circulation because in the real world, Codex G, Codex H, Codex M, Codex Omega, Codex E, Codex F, Codex S, Codex U, and Codex Pi, and 047 include material from John 7:53 through 8:11. Now, some of them might be, there might be variants. It might be uniform and an exact reproduction. You can say that about practically any 12-verse section of John. That many manuscripts will not have it down exactly that way. But this phrase, 3 out of 322, those 322 don't have all of them don't have the Gospel of John. Most of them do not. In the real world, the manuscript, the counting contest, if not the counting contest, that's the way to solve all problems. But just to raise the question, those 322, most of those don't even have the Gospel of John at all. In other words, it's like saying, how can you say that this president won the contest? Because on Earth there are 7 billion people. 6 billion people did not vote for him. Well, if they're not American citizens, surely that's superfluous, right? Who cares if 6 million non-Americans didn't vote for this particular one? That's superfluous. That's what we're doing. That runs parallel to what we're seeing Dan Wallace do when he brings up that 322 number. That's just the number of uncials of anything. When it comes down to focus on, can we focus on the ones that matter? Actual copies of the Gospel of John? Well, if we didn't do that, there's a reason why Dr. Wallace does not do this, because he knows very well that if we would consider all the manuscripts by number, there's 1,500 that do have the passage, only about 270 that don't. So we'll just kind of set those aside, focus on the uncials. But then when it comes to the uncials, okay, well, let's focus on the uncials that are actually copies of the Gospel of John, right? But when you do that, it's a much closer contest. It's practically even, about 18 versus about 18. Plus, there's 2 uncials, the Codex Delta and Codex L, that when you come to this part of John, instead of saying, yeah, we shouldn't have it, yeah, we shouldn't have it. They have a blank space where between the end of chapter 753 and the beginning of chapter 8, verse 12, which would involve a situation somewhere in the either in the ancestry of that manuscript or right there in the scriptorium making that manuscript, where a scribe is saying, one of my exemplars has it, and one of my exemplars, my master copies, doesn't have it. What am I to do? How shall I decide? Or how shall I give an opportunity for the eventual owner of the manuscript I'm making to decide? Well, they left a blank space, not necessarily enough to fit in the passage, depending on how large you're writing, but enough to convey the scribe had a question here. It's what's called memorial space, and those aren't the only places where it occurs. That's something that occurs in other manuscripts and other places too. But at least two scribes made memorial space so as to convey, I have an exemplar that I've been following that doesn't have it, but I also have a recollection of a manuscript that does have it. Something is missing in my exemplar here. So when you include that, it's practically a numerical tie between how many have it and how many don't. It's about 16 versus 16 with a buffer zone of about 3 or 4 manuscripts that could go either way. So the 3 out of 322 is a phantom statistic that nobody who wants to be taken seriously should use ever.
That is a fantastic point, brother. Do you wanna move on to the next statement?
Yes, this next statement is very significant. In some manuscripts, okay. Dr. Wallace said, it appears as a separate pericope at the end of all 4 Gospels, just tacked on at the very end. That's a reference to some members of Family 1, a particular cluster of manuscripts that have this feature. Not all of them have this feature, but the core members of that group do, called Family 1. But it's important when we mention that in some copies it is at the end of John, and you'll see this in some footnotes. For instance, the CSB footnote will mention, and some manuscripts have it at the end of John. First, it's not that many manuscripts, but within that group, in Family 1, and then its fellow member group, a chief member, 1582. If you're gonna mention that some manuscripts have it at the end of all 4 Gospels, in other words, at the end of John, you should mention the note that we see in Family 1, in Ministerial 1, and in 1582, the note that appears there before this passage begins at the end of John. And the note, let me check my references. I would get other opinions may differ, but my opinion is that it's irresponsible to mention it's there at the end of John. And not mention the note, because people are bound to get the impression this little story was floating around out there somewhere, and scribes liked it, and so they took it and they said, let's put this at the end of John. That impression is what's being conveyed here. I think if you take a poll of people that have taken this class, that's the impression that's being given. But in the real world, there's a note there in Manuscript 1 and 15 and Manuscript 1582. The note goes like this. The chapter about the adulteress in the Gospel according to John. This does not appear in the majority of copies. This is the note that's in Family 1. Obviously today it does appear in the majority. But the person who wrote the note said, in the Gospel of John, this does not appear in the majority of copies, nor is it commented upon by the Divine Fathers whose interpretations have been preserved, specifically by John Chrysostom and Cyril of Alexandria, nor is it taken up by Theodore of Mopsuestia and the others. For this reason, it was not kept in the place where it is found in a few copies at the beginning, and this is quite important, at the beginning of the 86th chapter. Now, when it says 86th chapter, that we should call time out and say, what's that mean, the 86th chapter? Eusebius of Caesarea, in the early 300s, made a way to cross-reference the parallel passages between the 4 Gospels. He made a well-organized chart delineating which Gospels have the same material in all 4 Gospels, which Gospels have the same material in 3 Gospels, which have between two gospels, and there were also different variations, like between Matthew and Luke, or between Matthew and Mark. And so you have basically 10 charts, and the last chart is for which passages are related in only one gospel. Eusebius made these 10 charts, and we see in many of our New Testament manuscripts of the Gospels, this chart appears. So this became a rather regular way of referring to how the book was divided up according to the numbers that Eusebius had assigned to each passage. In the 86th passage of John, according to the way that Eusebius had divided it up, that's where, so time in now. It is found in a few copies at the beginning of the 86th chapter, following, search and see that a prophet does not arise out of Galilee. So the note is referring to a copy that they had, one of those few copies that had it, and says, we found it in the Gospel of John, after the statement, search and see that a prophet does not arise out of Galilee. In other words, John 7:52. We found it after John 7:52 and moved it back here. So instead of implying that it was just floating around out there somewhere, the note specifies that it was found after John 7:52 and was then moved to here at the end of the gospel. That note has a drastic impact on this evidence and how it should be interpreted, or rather, how it should not be interpreted. So all those three statements need significant clarification. Getting back to the point about the breadth of the patristic evidence, when you look at where it's coming from, you don't see a lot of it in Egypt, but you do see a lot of it in the West. You do see the reference in the Latin capitula that I already mentioned, but also apostolic constitutions around the year 380. That was a significant event. It was had a great impact, and you also see Ambrose of Milan using the passage in Apologia David. If that is Ambrose, he refers to it as a Lectionary. So by the time of Ambrose, not only is it known, but it's already being used routinely in the church services. And this is Milan. This is not some obscure backwater. This is the city of Milan. This is at some points the de facto capital. So again, why are these things not told? I don't know. Maybe people are scared to look at the evidence that doesn't point their way.
Yeah, wasn't Ambrose a pretty significant early church father? He was considered a titan. In fact, he was very instrumental in having Augustine come to the faith.
Yes, I think that the preaching of Ambrose was critical to Augustine's conversion historically.
Yeah, so he was a very important figure. So, and I do believe that writing is definitely, I've never seen anybody call it pseudo Ambrose or listed as Ambrosiaster. I believe it is in the official corpus of Ambrose, isn't it?
Yes, but there have been some that analysts who would say, well, we're not really sure. It doesn't have as good a track record as far as tracking it down to Ambrose that some other writings have. So I would always throw in that some question whether it actually is Ambrose. I've seen references to that, but if it's not Ambrose, it's somebody else using it as a lection. Somebody else. So it's one more witness in that case. So it's kind of a no lose situation either way. But if it is Ambrose, and Ambrose, by the way, does use the pericope adultery. He does use the passage in other of his writings too. So
Wonderful.
It's definitely in Ambrose's text, no matter how you slice it.
That's a great point that you made there, brother, because even if that particular work is not Ambrose, the fact that he does utilize it in other areas, and the fact that Augustine, who borrowed so much from his father Ambrose, that lends even more credence to it, doesn't it?
Yes. As far as the Witness of the West is concerned, it's very strongly attested. We have, again, just go back to the list that I mentioned before. These guys don't represent just one locale. We've got West Africa, we've got Italy, we got wherever Codex Fuldensis comes from. You can just look it up. I'm sure it's not hard to find. Prosper of Aquitaine, Gelasius, and again Gregory the Great, and Cassiodorus. Gregory, there is Vivarium. He had well, we don't really know how significant his collection was, but he had a collection of copies that he and Cassiodorus. Even though we wouldn't say, well, let's adopt whatever text Cassiodorus had, because he had a Latin text. He didn't really have the kinds of manuscripts that we have, like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, but he still had a significant library there. And that's certainly something to take into consideration.
Yeah, very, very good point. Is there perhaps another slide that you would like to look at, brother?
I think I have 2404 there somewhere. Yeah, I think we just by it. Just back that up. Here we have.
Oh, my bad. Right here.
Here we have Codex Delta, and there you can see the blank space. Here's the end of chapter 7, verse 52. Then just the beginning of chapter 8, verse 12, and that's when it dawns on him. Wait a minute, something's missing here. Let's leave a blank space. And so he left a blank space, not an immense blank space, but enough to say to a person reading it, so the scribe had questions about this part, right? So here we see one of those manuscripts in that buffer zone where here's a manuscript that's obviously doesn't have the passage, but also has plenty of plain evidence that somebody sensed there's something missing in his master copy. So he left practically almost a whole page with a text there. So that's Codex Delta. But if you go back up, there's also another one where there's a symbol on the page that I want to point out. Oh, here is Codex 1333. And how to describe this? I think that Dan Wallace and I think James White might also have misused this evidence. But in manuscript 1333, here's the page of the manuscript, because it's online. There's a slide of it at the Library of Congress website, which can be tracked down. But here's the page of the manuscript that has John 8:3 through 11. And I think sometimes you find references that say, oh, it's found in a manuscript, or a manuscript even has the story of the adulteress at the end of Luke. So again, what they're trying to convey is that it was just floating around out there like a butterfly. In the real world, here's the evidence from 1333. What we have here, if you can enlarge that for me, because I think it's important for people to see some of the details.
Definitely,
it's
brother.
Not the story of the woman caught in adultery from John 7:53 through 8:11. What we have here is John chapter 8, verse 3 through 11. In other words, what we have here is a lection for Saint Pelagia. And this gets into if you recall my whole theory of how the passage got lost, this interlocks with that a bit, but I don't think we have time to go over the whole thing today. But just to explain the evidence from the one manuscript that is what's being referred to when James White or Daniel Wallace says that we have the story found at the end of Luke, between Luke and John, as if it's just been drawn from who knows where. In the real world, you can see at the top of the page, this is the reading for October the 8th for Saint Pelagia. In other words, it's the lection for Saint Pelagia's Day for October the 8th. That would be read every year when October the 8th came around. This is her reading. It's not the whole story of the adulteress, because 753 is not there. 8:1 is there. Is not there. 8:2 is not there. It begins at verse 3. And you can even see, so people sometimes use this as if to say, oh, it's floating around and they put it here. No, if you look carefully at the Greek title there, it says plain as day, from John. The same kind of rubric that you have before every lection in a lectionary. It's not drawn from just some random source. It's taken from a lectionary and put here. What happened is that manuscript 1333, initially when it was produced, did not have the passage. But somebody later on who owned or had possession of manuscript 1333 wanted to put this lection in there. Instead of writing in the margin of chapter 8, because it might be a very crowded margin in that case, they happened to find a blank space at the beginning of John, and so they said to themselves, well, looks like this is about enough space to hold this text, and so they put it in there. But it wasn't a random, it was floating around somewhere, so they put it in there. It was at a time rather late in history, and they had a lectionary and put this text in there along with the instructions at the top of the page, that in the real world you can look in there and see very plainly it's a lection for St. Pelagia's day, and just as plainly that it's for the Gospel of John, taken from the Gospel of John. So the impression that is given by the abuse of the evidence, by the molding of the evidence, is cleared up when you actually look at the page, which some writers seem to have never done, or else they looked at the evidence and just didn't know what to do with it. Either way, manuscript 1333, besides being a witness to 1333 initially not having the passage, is also a witness to the inclusion of it there in Luke. Does not mean it was just floating around. It means that it was taken from a lectionary, and it was identified specifically as a reading, not being the whole story of the adulteress, but just verses 8:3 through 11, reading for St. Pelagia for October the 8th, the reading taken from John. This is a case where I think something that Dean Bergen, a textual critic of the late 1800s, once he said that when people have taken this witness as if it's against the reading that I advocate, they've taken it as if it's for their side, but actually it's for mine. Kind of like Balak and Balaam in the Old Testament, where Balak says, "I told you to curse them, and here you are blessing them." And the same thing repeatedly happens. For instance, and this is a shining example of somebody taking a witness which they brought forth, thinking, well, this is going to be against the story of the adulterers. But actually, we see in real life, it favors the story of the adulterers. It shows that when 1333 was made, and when this adaptation was added to it, that the story was already part of the standard lection being used by the church.
That is a great point, because if it was a standard that was being used by the church, that lends even more credence to whether or not what side we fall on, the one that we think that we believe it does belong with the text, or the one where we think it doesn't. So far, the amount of evidence I've seen, brother, really does lean towards it definitely belonging in the text. Is there perhaps, let me see, is there perhaps another one that you'd like to look at? I think we have.
Yes, I think we had a 14. Is that 1424?
No, I'll find it.
I think we slowly scroll down.
Yeah, I'll find it. Let me go.
I might have sent you a different set, 1424, but 1187 will do fine if you can
okay
on that.
Definitely.
Now this is taken from a piece of microfilm, so you're not going to see the colors here. That's artificial color. But as you can see, somebody's first of all, look at the title for it. The Gospel of John usually has 18 chapters. So it's not as many as the other Gospels. For instance, Mark has like 48 chapters. In John, the chapters are much bigger than the other Gospels are. But here we have the heading and that titloid there, the adulteress. And then somebody's put in English letters or in Latin letters the verse numbers. So there's 53, and go down to 2, and look down here. There's the beginning of the lection. And that's where you see the asterisks begin, or the obli. But you see them not at the first part, but you see them only begin at the second part, at verse 3, that agalsin. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah.
But that's where you see the begin. This is still the story of the adulteress in verse 2, and in verse 1, and in verse 53. We don't see any asterisks there. So you might say, I wonder why those asterisks are there. And usually you find things like what Dan Wallace would say, Well, the asterisks are there to convey doubt. Of course, that's what scribes did. They conveyed doubt with asterisks. Now, if you go through a lot of manuscripts and look for asterisks, you can often find them not at places that were there to express doubt. They were used, I mean, sometimes they were used to express doubt, but by far more times they're used as part of the lectionary apparatus. In the Greek lectionary system, the lection to be read on Pentecost, a major feast day, the same Pentecost that's been celebrated ever since the Christian church began on the day of Pentecost. The Pentecost lection in the Gospel of John began at 7:37. It went to 7:53 and concluded in verse 12 of chapter 8. So the story of the adulteress, or what we know as the story of the adulteress, was not included for the Pentecost reading. For St. Pelagia, you also have a reading within there, what we know as most of the story of the adulteress, not the first 3 verses, but the rest of it. That's where you see the asterisk to tell the lector, the person doing the reading, this is its own reading. Even though there's most of the Pentecost reading before this, and a little bit the final flourish after it, between that and that, we have this. So the lector doesn't just hit verse 52 and keep on reading, almost doubling the size of the Pentecost lection. So he skips that part. Now, as you know from our previous talk about this, I would propose that somebody very, very early, I'm talking about 100s, that how the story went missing was that somebody had a copy that was prepared for the lector. A copy that was a good copy. It was prepared for the lector, the official reader of a particular church. And this lector was given instructions, for instance, just little marks that would say, skip from here down to the next mark. And the next mark would begin in verse 8, verse 12, it would say, resume here. So the instructions for the lector were very simple. Skip from here to here, which meant, skip from this point. Now this manuscript, it's at chapter 8, verse 2. In this earlier manuscript, I would say from John 7:53 is where it said, start skipping from here down to a different part. But that copy, with those notes for the lector, got into the hands of a copyist. And the copyist, who is very disciplined, pretty good at what he does, he sees those notes and says, okay, I will do just what I'm supposed to do. I will do what I'm told. He sees the note at the end of John 7:52 that says, skip down, jump down. So he does. And thus, John 7:53 through 8:11 go missing, because it's at 8 verse 12 that his notes say, in the margin of his copy, his master copy, resume here. And thus, thinking that he's doing exactly what he's been told to do, he doesn't transmit chapter 7 verse 53 down to 8 verse 11. And in the scriptorium where he's working from, depending on how many copies he makes, that becomes the form of the text that gets perpetuated. And the next generation of copies go on from there. But in this particular passage, we see, not only do we see asterisks, not of the whole passage, which again, a important detail that Wallace and other textual critics who comment on the passage have completely failed to point out. That we see that's what's being conveyed by those obelisks. But there's also a note at the bottom, and that note is also significant. If we could just kind of zoom in there, and let me browse through my notes here. Sorry for the delay.
No problem at all, brother. All of this is fascinating. I know people are probably just being totally blown away at this kind of information. I mean, it's just really incredible. And for people that are tuning in, don't worry. We're going to open up the floor to Q&A. Anything you may have on your mind, think about it right now, and the brother James will definitely love to get to your question.
Okay, well, I'm not finding it, but I really wish I had that. I even had it. Oh wait, maybe it's over here. Okay. there's a reference at the bottom of this to the patristic writings that we just mentioned before, apostolic constitutions. But basically, it says the obelisks. Let me just see if I can wing it. The obelized passage, in other words, the passage with those little marks on it, they look kind of like division signs to us, but they're meant to describe as an obelisk.
Yep.
The obelized portion, in some copies, do not appear, nor do they appear in the writings, but in the old ones, yeah, this is significant. In the old ones, they all appear. Now, how many times have you heard of from anybody that's commented on this, from trying to take the opposite side? How many of them pointed this out, that this note says, the margin note in these copies says that it's in all the old ones? Did anyone else ever point that out? Did James White ever point that out? Not that I recall.
No.
But I'm trying to follow my notes here. I realize the whole thing exactly. But it says, but at the end, it will say, we found it, and we found it in the old ones, and the apostles approved it, and it's edifying for the church. So this is the reason it's used by the person that made this note. So this isn't one scribe making this note. Essentially the same note appears in several other copies. So it goes back to a date earlier than all these copies. When they refer to the old copies, they've got to be older than all the copies that have the note, because the note itself descends from an earlier source. So that's something that we take into consideration whenever we consider. And again, I missed my pages up.
And all of that is very, very fascinating and really incredible information, brother. I think really information that you when you look up this kind of an issue online, the preponderance of evidence you're going to find is for the other side, their case being presented, but your case is really, it's one that you just don't find presented. You don't really find this kind of information elsewhere. But you did tell the audience. I do want to open it up for people that may have questions. By the way, if you have questions, press a button to raise your hand, ask a question, or put it in the chat. But brother, before people ask questions, you said you got a book. Where can they find your book, and where can they find your webpage so they can check your material out?
They can go to curtisvillecc.com. That's the church where I minister. And at curtisvillecc.com, they'll see a button that refers to text critical resources. If they click that button, they'll see a page open up, God willing, that will have a list of various kinds of resources. Some will be book reviews. Some will be buttons that will lead to collections of manuscripts that are online. And in the third margin, to the right, there are some essays that I've written. And there is one button there that if they scroll down, starts in Matthew and works its way down from there. But those buttons will take them to various resources over various specific New Testament passages. And one of them is for John 7:53 through 8:11. Once they click on that button, they'll see another page open up, and that will have various discussions of different aspects of this issue. Some of them are responses to things that James White has made, some false claims that he has perpetuated. I respond to him there, and also some problematic claims that Dan Wallace has made. Sometimes false, sometimes very, very, very imprecise or vague, or leaving out key aspects of the evidence that really should be considered. And so there are things there that kind of answer kind of a pushing back against those that would want to remove the passage from the text. Also, I have a reference to my ebook, which is like 99 cents, called a fresh analysis of John 7:53 through 8:11, and that is online at Amazon. But also, if you go to academia.edu, it's there free to download. So those are two ways for folks to obtain the book. But by Amazon, if you'd like to, just chip in 99 cents. But also, if that's too much, I've also put it online at Amazon. Anybody that can download it can download it.
We have one gentleman wondering, thank you very much for that, James. One gentleman wondering, James Snap, is the English translation to the Dead Sea Scrolls accurate? Are you able to comment on that? Have you even looked at that?
Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't really pertain directly to the New Testament text. That's talking about Old Testament text and various other texts that community that Qumran had. When it comes to the text of Samuel, when it comes to the text of the Psalms, we have a much earlier reference in the Dead Sea Scrolls than in Hebrew than the next earliest substantial source is by far. So in those places, for instance, in the Psalms, particularly, when there's a major difference, I think in one of the Psalms that's an acrostic psalm, there's a verse there that in the typical Bible isn't there. In places like that, if you have secondary support, for instance, from the old Syriac text, then I would say that would be a reading very much worth consideration. That should be either included in the text itself or at least noted for when major portions of text are written in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we don't see in the Masoretic text. And this is all kind of a by the way, but I would say in those cases the Dead Sea Scrolls are accurate. In other cases where it's just one reading that an explanation can be given for why that reading would arise. In those cases, I would definitely stick with the overall Masoretic text when there's no secondary support for what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay.
Very good, brother. We have one other individual wondering, Brother Snap, can you give your view of the textual variants of Revelation 22:14, the KJV compared to other translations? Are you able to comment on that at all?
Let me turn that for just a second, make sure it is what I think it is.
I have it open here in case that helps. Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the city. I have not heard of that, but then again, I'm no expert.
Yeah, I would say with what's on my desk right now, I'm not equipped to look into that one. I'd have to give it a second. I tend to compartmentalize things, and I don't want to say a whole lot about that particular part of that particular verse without having a few other resources stacked up around me. I would point out though that the last 6 verses of Revelation, in the what's called the Textus Receptus, the base text of the King James, it was based on just one manuscript. And on my blog, if you search there at the text of the Gospels.com, search at the text of the Gospels.com for the number 2814 Erasmus, and hopefully that should take you straight to an analysis of the one manuscript that Erasmus had when he to finish his work, to finish the compilation of the Greek New Testament. He was using one particular manuscript because he could only obtain one manuscript, and that was 2814. For a while, it was lost, but it was then refound. It is now online, and so anybody can look at the pages of that manuscript and see that its text of Revelation ends, I think, there in verse 16. The rest of the text, the remaining text, Erasmus backslated into Greek from Latin, which means that in the Textus Receptus, for the rest of that, we have basically there not entirely, because there was some other sources involved too, but we have basically Erasmus's retro translation from Latin into Greek. Now, as a retro translation, he did a pretty good job, but is that the same as having the dozens and dozens of copies of Revelation and using that evidence instead, as preferred to a back translation made by Erasmus just to finish the book? I would say definitely we should favor the actual translation of the actual Greek text and not just Erasmus's retro translation. But that's just a detail of the kinds of things that get involved in looking into the text of Revelation.
Great answer, brother. Albert, did you have a question for the
Yeah.
brother James?
Yes, please. Taking the opportunity whilst you're mentioning the Dead Sea Scrolls, how many books of the Septuagint have in fact been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls? And in which language were they written? Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, and Aramaic?
Well, I'd have to look it up. I came to talk about the story of the woman caught in adultery, but a short answer would be when we talk about the Septuagint, we're talking about a Greek text by definition. Now, would it be possible for somewhere among the Dead Sea Scrolls that there could be a translation of a book of the Septuagint? It's not impossible, but that's something I would leave to more specialized research. So as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we talk about the Septuagint, I think that there are some copies, and it kind of defines it kind of depends on how you define a Dead Sea Scroll, because there are the initial caves, and then there's things that were coming from here or there from further north that have kind of been lumped in with the Dead Sea Scrolls, even though they might not necessarily have the same historical line of descent. So it could depend on how you define a Dead Sea Scroll. But I'm sure that there are materials by Vanderham and some others that could provide the answer.
I do believe I've heard that they did find some of them, but how many of them, which ones? I don't have the list, but.
Well, there's the Pesher commentary on the Minor Prophets. There's that one. But if you just do a search online for Dead Sea Scrolls, Septuagint, I'm sure you'll get some hits.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Brother Albert. And Enrique wants to know, what is the best translation, in your opinion, of the Greek term monogenes in New English? Is the traditional translation of only begotten perhaps the best one, in your opinion?
Well, I favor that translation. I think it's not only valid, but I think also it's historically significant when you look at the interpretive questions, the issues that arose in the 300s and even into the 400s about what does monogenes mean? What does it imply? I think it's more than just only son. I don't think that's a sufficient rendering, because only just means only, and it would just mean no difference from mono. But there's also the genes part. So those two things come together. In fact, on my blog at the Text of the Gospels, when I look into John 1:18, where the term appears in Greek, I don't know the exact words, but again, use the search bar to search for John 1:18, and I have a 4-part series of essays about that verse. The first part of those 4-part essays is about what does monogenes mean? How should it be interpreted? How should it be rendered? I think that there have been some arguments that were used way back when the NIV was first coming out that were just kind of accepted, but then that was kind of premature, and then some pushback came on after that. So I think that is a rendering that I hope the versions that now use one and only will realize that's shallow. That's not what that's not the full sense of this term. So I much prefer the term, the rendering only begotten.
Great point, brother. I appreciate that. We'll take one more, and then we'll wrap it up. So, and then we'll let the brother James, give some final thoughts. And we do have a question from Mark. Mark would like to know, Brother James, can you elaborate on Jesus writing in the sand and Jeremiah 17:13? Is there any connection there?
Not one that can be really hammered down to the idea of this has to be what it means. In Jeremiah, we have the reference for what we see here on screen. It says, "Those who depart me shall be written in the earth, because they've forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters." But the question is, when Jesus is in the story of the woman caught in adultery, at one point he writes on the ground, and of course one obvious question would be, but what did he write? Why leave it there? It'd be nice if we lived in a world in which all the questions that could possibly come up were answered. This is one possible answer, that the names were written down as being condemned, or that there's, or that, excuse me, or that their sins were written in the earth. I think in some of the early expanded forms of the passage, you even have this detail given, that their sins were what was written. That when they looked upon the stones, they saw their sins. In a famous Armenian copy of that has a story of an adulteress, it mentions that they were seeing their sins upon the stones. So that's one possibility. Do we know for sure? Well, no, we don't know for sure. We don't have that clearly established in the text. But that's one possibility. Another possibility is simply their names, kind of interlocking there with the passage from Jeremiah. That's more like a parallel that you could make, but do you have to make it that way? Not really. But those are some of the options that are out there.
Brother,
I wouldn't regard that as anything more than a possibility.
Thank you very much for that answer, brother. And thank you, everybody, for the questions. And brother, thank you for the time that you've taken today to talk about a very confusing topic, a difficult topic. This will be available on YouTube for people to go back and really look at it, listen, digest all of the incredible material that the brother has put forth. Brother, do you want to say any closing statements before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think there was one other slide that I had that we haven't covered yet.
Oh, really? Okay. Let me find it. Do you know?
Codex 2404.
There we go. My bad. Here we go.
Yeah, this is a medieval copy. It's not particularly old, but what I would like to point out is the jump ahead symbol is right there in the text, and you see right there in red. There's this symbol of what was called the hyperbole. What we get the word hyperbole. That what looks like a U, and then it looks kind of looks like there's a pie, not a pizza pie, but the letter pie, and then the letter B. In Greek, that would be an abbreviation for that word, which would mean jump ahead. And when you start looking for it, if you know what to look for, and I don't think Daniel Wallace has correctly identified what this symbol is in his descriptions of one or two manuscripts that he's examined. He completely misidentified this symbol. It means jump ahead. And then you would see the resume here later on at verse 12. But that's the symbol that means jump ahead. So here you can see, as far as what did the church ordinarily use and what they would read in their church services. In the reading for Pentecost, you would start at John 7:37, but then you wouldn't read the story about the adulteress. You would skip ahead to verse 12. But here in the text that does have the story of the adulteress, we see this little 4 dots down here on the second to last line. You see the 4 dots. That's where the lecture begins for St. Pelagia's Day. But before that, at the end of verse 52, at the beginning of verse 53, we have that jump ahead symbol. And this would explain the whole thing if this was a very early lection cycle, not a later developed lectionary, but just a lection cycle for the major feast days of the church. All that would need to happen is the scribe gets a copy of John that's been prepared for a lector and misinterprets the instructions for the lector as if they're meant for him. So he does what the lector did at the end of John 7:52. He jumps ahead to chapter 8, verse 12. And that is a very simple explanation for the loss of the passage. It is missing in the major Alexandrian manuscripts like P75 and Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. But we see the explanation by simply applying logic to what you see, and not just 2404. You could look at dozens of manuscripts and see these same symbols being perpetuated by the scribes as they copy the passage. But all it would take is one who doesn't understand it, who thinks that it's meant for him, to make a copy of John without those 12 verses. Also, since I mentioned Codex Vaticanus, I should bring it up. I don't have a slide here, but you can find Codex Vaticanus online. And then on my blog, I have an index to it, book by book, for the New Testament portion. And you can find the page at the end of John, and you'll see that off to the side, there are these two little dots. Now, lots of folks, when they look at those dots, they think, I think that Dan Wallace has proposed that when you see those two little dots, that means there's a textual variant that the scribe was aware of. Now, we don't know for sure who put the dots there. They could be somebody medieval. But if the dots are contemporary with the scribe of Codex Sinaiticus, then those two dots after the end of John, that put there after the blank space, if those two dots go back to Vaticanus, then that means that would mean, and again, with all those qualifications in place, if then those two dots would mean the copyist of Vaticanus was aware of a textual variant after the end of John, and the only textual variant, the only contender is the story of the adulteress transferred, like in Family 1, to follow John 21.
Fantastic points there, brother. Great points, and greatly appreciate your time. And for everybody to tuning in, we promise we will we'll try and bring the brother James on again to talk about any other topic that may be on your mind, things that you are interested in, brother. And people, go over to his website, check out his blog, check out his stuff he has on Amazon, check out all of that. And brother, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to having you back on again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Everybody, God bless you all. Go share this and have a wonderful